The problem is that the private money doesn't flow to the poor countries. There are a lot of reasons for that, but the main one is a perception of risk. If you're poor, you're a bad credit risk. To my mind, this is economics upside down, because if you're poor, you can grow fast. If you're rich, you can't really grow fast.
Welcome to Season 2 of the Geneva Connection. Over the next 4 episodes, we'll explore one of the most pressing questions in sustainable development: how do we finance the future? This season, we look at the $4 trillion annual gap in financing the SDGs and ask how better designed models of investment, collaboration, and risk sharing can unlock the private capital needed at scale. We'll hear from leading economists, platform builders, practitioners, and policy experts. Together, we'll unpack why capital isn't flowing where it's needed most and how impact investing, blended finance, and catalytic capital can help close the gap. This season is produced in collaboration with the SDG Impact Finance Initiative, SIFI. I'm Luca Biernacki, your host for this season. Let's begin. We're starting this season with a step back to examine the foundations of development finance itself. What exactly are we trying to finance, and why is capital still failing to reach the places that need it most? Perhaps no one is better equipped to answer this than Professor Jeffrey Sachs, economist, author, and one of the world's most influential voices on sustainable development. In this conversation, we explore why he sees development first and foremost as an investment challenge, why private capital stays out of poor economies, and what a new investment-led development model could look like. Professor Sachs, welcome to our podcast.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Where are we now with global development? And is the traditional aid model still fit for purpose? Or should we shift towards a more investment-driven approach?
Let me start, if I may, at the beginning. Development, meaning a steady, rapid economic improvement, is an investment challenge. It comes mainly through investments, both public and private, in an economy. And the kinds of investments are very important. Probably the most important single investment is in people, so-called human capital investment in education and health. A second category of investment is in physical infrastructure, which to a significant extent is the responsibility of government, the roads, the power lines, the energy sector, broadly speaking, water and sanitation, the ports and the airports and so forth. All of that physical infrastructure is essential for the functioning of an economy. And the third broad dimension of investment is in private business. But that by itself includes categories across the economy: in agriculture, in mining, in construction, in manufacturing, in resale and wholesale trade, in transport, in health and education sectors, in the finance sector, and so forth. Businesses drive a very substantial proportion of an economy, and for-profit businesses make investments that create enterprises, enlarge enterprises, hire workers, and so forth. Development requires investments in these 3 categories: human capital, physical infrastructure, and business. And these categories are complementary, meaning that you don't say, well, I'll do more business investment and I just won't get around to the human capital investment. That makes no sense. Without a trained workforce, you don't get the business investment. It makes no sense to say, well, I'll educate the young people and will promote business investment, but infrastructure, we don't have the budget for that. So sorry, there won't be a power grid. There won't be roads. There won't be rail. That obviously also isn't going to work. You need all three kinds of investments moving forward simultaneously. And for rapid economic development, which is what we want when countries are starting out impoverished, they need to develop rapidly, or else you're simply talking about leaving people in poverty for decades or generations to come. For that, you need large-scale investment in all three of these dimensions: the human capital, the infrastructure, and the business capital. Now, we have a good model of that in the last 45 years, and that's China. China is a country that went from poverty to high income status. It went from basically subsistence agriculture in villages for most of the population to a very modern urban society at the cutting edge of technology and at the cutting edge of innovation. How did it do that? Well, investment. It had a very high level of national saving and a very high level of investment in those three areas that I keep emphasizing: the human capital, the infrastructure, and the business development. So that comes to the question, what goes wrong with countries that are not succeeding as China did with rapid growth? And note that China's GDP, the gross domestic product, rose at a rate of around 10% per annum for nearly 40 years. And when something grows at 10% per year, it doubles in magnitude every 7 years. China's economy was doubling in size roughly every 7 years. That means that per person, it was growing enormously fast, much faster, the economy, than the population growth, which was quite modest. And so the GDP per person in China soared. And over the period of 40 years, China had at least 5 doublings of the economy, meaning 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, or 32-fold increase. And that is what brought China from poverty to wealth. High investment rates sustained over a 40-year period. Well, how do you sustain high investment? You need finance. And then the question comes, what kind of finance? Well, precisely because we have 3 main categories of capital, we have different kinds of financing. To put kids in school is largely a public finance issue because governments run the schools by and large in almost every place in the world. You need a public budget. When it comes to infrastructure, usually it's either government or parastatals, state enterprises. They can borrow on their own if they're a public utility company, for example, or it may be a private company under contract with the government in some kind of build, operate, transfer scheme of public sector concession. So there are lots of varieties, but government plays a significant role in infrastructure as well. When it comes to business development, while government plays a role certainly in industrial policy, the main responsibility is enterprises that go to their banks or raise money from venture capitalists or raise money from out-of-pocket investments or float bonds. But the business capital is from the private savings to a very significant extent. All of this means that there is not one simple finance formula for development. Since the investment profile is complex, both public and private, the financing is necessarily complex. And just to add, some kinds of investment financing are out of current cash flow. Governments tax, they use the tax to make public investments. So that's direct. Some kinds of investments come from either borrowing, debt financed, or equity financed, where money is put up for ownership of the investment. And that means that we have different kinds of financial instruments, and some by the public sector and some by the private sector. Well, it's all a long-winded way to say to get development right, one needs capable government, one needs a private sector that's given room to go make profits. One needs enough predictability to say, I'm going to invest today because this investment's going to last for 30 years. I have confidence that I'm going to be able to use that investment over the next 30-year period. You need decent governance. You need to keep those young people that have been educated within the country, not leaving the country because of conflicts or lack of security or lack of safety or lack of opportunity. One needs, in other words, a strategy, a plan, an ability to implement a pretty complex set of objectives, and inherently to understand the mix of public and private financing that together makes the package that delivers development. Finally, let me say just in this opening thought that when we look at what's actually happening in the world today, there are a lot of developing economies, what we call the emerging and developing economies, that are growing rapidly. China, the exemplar. India today, the fastest growing large economy in the world. Like China, growing very fast, not quite as fast as China achieved, but still quite notable. The countries of Southeast Asia, so-called ASEAN countries for the Southeast Asian regional group, are diverse, but are also growing reasonably rapidly. In Africa, it's much patchier. Some countries are in dire crisis of poverty, and when their governments are told to invest, they say, invest with what? We have no tax revenue, we have no money, we have no capacity to do this. Whereas other parts of Africa are achieving economic growth. I would say overall, the global development situation is quite mixed, with most of Southeast, and East Asia growing quite rapidly, and then with the pockets of success in other parts of Asia, pockets of success in Africa, and some pockets of success in Latin America, but kind of blotchier experience. If we had China's success everywhere in the world, there'd be little more to discuss and debate. But we have some places trapped in poverty, other places succumbing to growing environmental crises, and other places that seemingly are just booming along and have that investment approach well honed.
Many emerging and developing economies have huge growth potential, but still struggle to attract the capital they need. Why is private investment still so limited in these markets, and what would it take to unlock it?
If you take the aggregate amount of investment in a developing country and you measure it properly, including education spending and healthcare spending as investment, not as consumption, but as part of the investment profile of the country, I think it's probably right to say that public and private investment are about half and half. Roughly 50% goes through the public sector. This may sound high to some listeners who think of investment as business, but we must remember the investments in human capital and infrastructure as being fundamental for development. A fast-growing developing country should be investing 40 to 50% of its national income per year. China routinely invested more than 40% of its national income and actually saved more than 40% of its national income per year. And that high saving ultimately was the source of the financing for almost all of the investment that was undertaken. Many very poor countries, however, saving is a very low proportion of income because there's nothing to save. People are trying to stay alive. They have no margin of survival, in which case the financing has to come not from the current saving out of production, but it has to come from borrowing or from foreign investments in some other way. For instance, foreign direct investment to build factories, bringing in capital from abroad. The big problem in very poor countries is that it's very hard to achieve levels of investment needed because the domestic base of saving and taxation is tiny by virtue of the poverty. And because of the poverty, the perceived risk of putting money into such countries is also very high. And so poor countries can be trapped by their poverty. They don't have the flow of domestic saving and taxation to finance the investments they need, and they can't access foreign capital from the bond markets, for example, or from foreign direct investment because they're perceived to be impoverished, broken countries with no development prospect. Now, as a development economist, I differ with that assessment in general. My own view is that even very poor countries have the potential for very rapid economic growth, and they have that potential for very rapid economic growth because starting at such a low level, they have a lot of headroom to raise education levels, to pave roads, to get fiber connectivity, to electrify the economy. And that leads to very rapid advances of GDP and the ability, therefore, to repay loans that are taken in order to achieve that rapid rate of development. But that's not how it's seen typically in the capital markets. Capital markets tend to look at very poor countries and they don't say, whoa, that country's so poor, it has the chance to grow super fast. They look at poor countries and say, that country is so poor, I'm not putting money there. And I'm certainly not putting pensioners' money there if I'm an investment fund for pensions. And I'm not going to allocate my wealth of a sovereign fund to these impoverished places. That just is an open gamble that I'm not politically prepared to take. So poor countries end up getting trapped. And unlocking that trap is one of the most important, if not the most important issues in development finance. There are several ways potentially to open up the spigot. One way, very direct, which I have long believed in, but which doesn't work at the scale needed, is development assistance, something called official development aid, but it can also be philanthropic money. My point has been for decades, the world's very rich, and if it would just give a very tiny proportion of its annual income from the high-income countries, that would be enough to overcome many of these barriers. All kids could be in school easily. Everybody could have access to health care. Everybody could have access to basic electricity and so forth. Well, I've tried to make this case for decades. It's largely fallen on deaf ears or resistant ears, especially in the United States. Look at my country, as rich as can be, as selfish as can be at the political level. We have a president who personifies selfishness, and he took as one of his first steps closing down the Development Aid Agency in the United States. the United States has been, quote, giving something like 0.15% of the national income in official development aid, roughly a fifth of what it should be doing according to international norms, which say at least give 0.7% of GDP. The United States hasn't been close to that for many, many decades because the system in the U.S. is geared to protect rich people and to neglect poor people or to reject poor people or to say poor people aren't deserving. That's the attitude. So this approach of development aid, which should be the easiest thing to do, the West has largely traditionally been a Christian West. We can recall the Gospels where Jesus says to feed the least among thee. So one could imagine that would be taken seriously. But I can tell you our governments have never taken that view about development assistance, even when they have spent a lot of money on fighting poverty within countries, within their own countries. I should add, by the way, the U.S. government doesn't even do that for America's poor, much less for the world's poor. So a second line of reasoning has been if you can't get it out of grants, transfers, which a generous world would do, at least get it out of loans. And we set up institutions like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and many others for the purpose of financing development. And that's fine as far as it goes. But just like official development assistance, the levels of funding from these multilateral finance institutions is really amazingly small. If you combine the World Bank funding and the funding of all of the regional development banks, the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and others, it comes to between $100 and maybe $150 billion of net lending per year in a $100 trillion world economy. So it doesn't reach 0.2% of world output. And the United States, as a shareholder of these institutions, has basically said in recent years, we're not putting in any more money into the capital base of these institutions, and no one else is either. And the reason no one else is either is the United States not only is incredibly stingy, but it doesn't want any other country getting more votes. So it says, we won't put in money, and we will insist that you don't put in money, rather than what people might intuitively think the United States could say, we won't put in money, but we encourage you to do so. The United States doesn't even do that. So in recent years, the so-called international finance institutions or the multilateral development banks do an important job, but at a very modest scale. So development aid is modest, and the lending from the multilateral development banks is modest. Then comes the question, well, what about private capital? Private saving is huge worldwide. About 30% of world output is saved every year. And since world output is 100 trillion plus, that means there's about 30 trillion plus of saving worldwide. Whoa, you could do a lot with that. You could ensure that every country absolutely meets its basic development objectives. The problem is that the private money doesn't flow to the poor countries. There are a lot of reasons for that, but the main one is a perception of risk. If you're poor, you're a bad credit risk. To my mind, this is economics upside down, because if you're poor, you can grow fast. If you're rich, you can't really grow fast. And so if there were better economics motivating the private financing, we'd get a lot farther. But I've had major financiers in Wall Street tell me, Mr. Sachs, don't count on me to lend to your friends. I'm not doing it. Just straight out. And that's the attitude. And the credit rating agencies give very low marks to these poor countries. They're almost all below investment grade. In other words, colloquially, at junk bond status. And the IMF and the World Bank actually don't help, surprisingly, even though those are official institutions to support development. They tell the poor countries, don't get into debt, you'll get into trouble. So keep your debt low, don't borrow, raise your domestic spending, which is not the smartest thing to say to starving people. It's not so easy just to save when you have nothing. But they tell them, don't borrow. Borrowing's dangerous, you'll get into debt trouble, and so forth. And the truth is, these countries do borrow short term, and then they do get into trouble because development also is a process that takes 20 or 30 or 40 years. So if you borrow at 5-year maturities or 7-year maturities, and you're a poor country, unless you can roll over that loan 7 years later, you're going to get into trouble. And rolling over a loan, if you're a poor country, is not a routine matter. Maybe everyone panics. Maybe people say, you're in trouble. We don't want to lend you any more money. We don't even want to refinance the debt that you have outstanding. All of this is to say the problem of development finance has not been solved for probably about half the world. The poor part of the world, the place is stuck in poverty, the place is facing greater crises of environmental disaster because of global environmental change, and so on. Maybe I should add one more word about that. Even as we speak, there are massive floods going on in Hong Kong. There have been droughts and floods and heat waves and massive forest fires all over the world in recent months, massive typhoons and hurricanes, because we have global climate change. Another thing, my president, I was going to use adjectives which are not for polite company, but the president of the United States denies. The world should not be run by idiocy. The world should not be run by denial. The world should take seriously serious things, but sometimes we're not governed by grown-up behavior. And that is the case with the environmental crisis. But the point I wanted to make is another point. If you're suffering from droughts and heat waves and forest fires, you're not responsible for that. That has come from a global visitation of fossil fuel use over the last century, overwhelmingly from the rich world. So you might imagine, now you wouldn't imagine, but you might hope, maybe in your dreams, that rich country governments would say, we're so sorry for what's happening. We know you're not responsible for it. We're going to give you financing so that you can make your economies resilient, so that you can adapt to climate change, so you can build in the infrastructure to ensure you have water and sanitation and drought resistance and so on. Well, of course, I'm dreaming or fantasizing. The United States says, we have no responsibility. We don't even believe in climate change. You're on your own, and we walk out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So one other avenue of finance, which is compensation for historical responsibility. Very basic. If this were a court of law, it wouldn't be a problem. You'd pull the U.S. into court. You'd say, you are responsible for 1/4 of the global emissions. It's not charity we're asking for. It's compensation for damages done by you.
At the beginning of this conversation, you said, development is fundamentally an investment challenge. Given the scale of needs in education, infrastructure, and business, what kinds of financing approaches can help countries close this gap?
Basically, a lot of that financing has to be raised in the marketplace. In other words, even governments of low-income countries should borrow in order to make sure that they can afford to put every child in school. Now, the IMF says that what I just said is a horrendously bad idea. They say, oh, don't borrow, you'll just create a debt crisis. But the IMF hasn't solved the problem of hundreds of millions of kids out of school. I'd rather governments borrow and get the kids in school than leave them out of school. But so far, nobody's cared enough to actually solve this particular problem. My view is the private sector could provide the financing, but we need a different approach, a different understanding, a different economic framework. Most importantly, we need long-term financing, not short-term, because put a first grader in school, borrow for 10 years, that first grader is in 11th grade, not exactly earning the income to repay the loan or paying the taxes to the government to repay the loan that the government took. Put a first grader in school and borrow for 40 years. Then by 40 years, that first grader has gotten a university degree. They've been in the workforce for 15 years, say, and they've generated a lot of national income going to taxation to pay back to the government through taxes what the government borrowed to put them through school. So structuring the financing in the right kind of way could make a huge difference. And I'm trying to encourage the IMF and the World Bank to look forward, not for 5 years, but for 40 years, and to ask a different question from the question they ask, which is, how do we finance rapid growth over the next 40 years in country X, starting from its impoverishment, but taking into account that it has great potential for rapid development if the kids are in school, if the roads are paved, if the power lines exist, if the digital access is universal, if there is climate resilience. Whoa, that country can double every decade in GDP, or maybe like China for some periods at least double every 7 years. And then what looks like a lot of debt today relative to an impoverished economy is really quite modest to repay if the economy is doubled and doubled and doubled again over the coming 30 or 40 years. So my basic answer is we need to rethink and restructure the financing and appreciate the basic lesson of development, which is that it's not a miracle. It's not the preserve of a particular country or particular culture or particular religion. Development is accessible by every region of the world, but it needs patient capital in order to make the investments that lead to the economic.
How do you see governments and the private sector working together to deliver the investments needed for growth?
If you want to accomplish what I've just said, you need a vision, first of all. You need a plan. You need to be able to tell investors, look, we're going to be 8 times richer in 30 years. And they're going to say, well, why do you say so? And you're going to whip out your spreadsheets and explain how this is going to unfold and what the government's going to do to ensure that success, and to explain why the country's not going to get into debt crisis in the intermediate period, and sector by sector, how there will be shared responsibilities. For example, in the power sector, the government may say, look, we take responsibility for the distribution grid, transmission lines, distribution lines, and so on, but we allow independent power producers to finance new power projects, get connected to the grid, and thereby make money off of their private investments as well. That's absolutely conventional in the power sector, that you have independent power producers, but you have a state utility which may own and operate the transmission system. It's even a little bit more complicated because these days, when you want solar power, wind power, hydropower, you want to connect countries together, not just a system within a country, but maybe 3 or 4 or 5 regional neighbors together, because one has solar, one has wind, one has hydro. Or when it's windy in one place, maybe it's cloudy in another, so the sun isn't shining and the solar isn't working as intensively. All of this is to say that not only do you need a plan, not only do you need public and private investment, but you also stand to have a big benefit from regional cooperation as well. So I'm working with regional groupings, for example, the ASEAN countries, 10 countries in Southeast Asia, to encourage them to develop a regional zero carbon power system. I'm working with the countries of Central Asia, 5 countries of Central Asia, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, because they're in an integrated region. They should interconnect their infrastructure, transport, digital, power sector, for their mutual benefit. So that's another dimension.
And how does cooperation between governments and the private sector affect the way development finance is structured?
Well, certainly it affects everything about what we're actually doing right now, because the standard model first says to developing countries, or at least the poor ones, don't borrow very much. So it leaves them without electricity, without schools, and so on. Second, it's country by country. The World Bank has country clients. They deal with an individual country. They don't deal with regions as a whole. And so the traditional model doesn't work. This is the most basic point. It's not working. It did work in some places. I don't want to say it doesn't work entirely, but it has left a lot of the world behind. And we have to understand why it has left those regions behind and what to do about it. And for that, we need a regional approach. We need a forward-looking financing approach. We need a longer time horizon. We need more strategy.
By 2030, what would genuine success in development finance look like to you?
I would like to see the developing countries routinely investing 40% of their GDP. If you add across the human capital, the infrastructure, and the business investment, at least. Maybe for some of the poor countries, even a higher proportion than that. I'd like to see the developing countries routinely growing at least 5% per year GDP growth, but up to 7 or 8% GDP growth. We know China hit 10% for quite a long time. This kind of rapid growth is feasible. I'd like to see a revamping of all of the guidelines of development finance to understand that investing in poor countries is a good investment. In fact, it's a very high return investment if it's done right. I'd like to see a rethinking of what is risk, what are appropriate risk ratings by the credit rating agencies. I'd like to see the IMF and the World Bank completely rethink the advice that they give to developing countries, not to tell them, play it safe, don't borrow, stay in poverty, but be quiet, and rather tell them, we're going to be at your side so you finally get out of poverty, which is an inexcusable condition in the 21st century.
Is there anything you'd like to add before we close?
We absolutely can have a world of sustainable development in which we not only end poverty and enable the poorer countries to grow rapidly and to at least gradually converge in income levels with the richer countries, but we can and should do this together with structural transformation so that our economies are greener, more sustainable, so that our agriculture is more precision agriculture, less wasteful of land, and less disastrous for biodiversity. In fact, not disastrous, I should say. for biodiversity. So I would like us to understand all of that's feasible. You can write it down, you can quantify it, you can show a path to the future, but you should understand it's not going to come from the current structure. And so we should keep that vision of ambition. We should work harder to understand how actually to achieve it, not just to state goals, but how to actually get there. And then at least a coalition of the willing of 150 plus countries should work on it together. My own country, it's a little bizarre right now. The United States, it just views itself as living on a different planet, or maybe that's Elon Musk's hope. I don't know what, but the U.S. will come back to this and should not be seen as an obstacle to the vast majority of the world.
Professor Sachs, thank you very much.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
That's it for this opening episode of the Geneva Connection Season 2. Next time, we go inside the engine room to see how blended finance can unlock private capital for impact investing in emerging markets and help close the SDG funding gap. We'll look how better data, standardization, liquidity, and risk alignment can help these investments reach their full potential and get capital flowing where it's needed most. Join us for that conversation, and don't forget to subscribe. You may also follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube. And for now, from Geneva, goodbye.